Well, every year the World Economic Forum comes out with its Global Risks Report. It's a report which talks about the state of the world's economy, some of the biggest economic challenges, but also socio-economic challenges which the world faces. Mirek Dusek is somebody who's been associated closely with the report this year. He is a managing director here at the World Economic Forum. Wonderful to speak to you. Thanks very much for being with us. We all come over here with a sense of optimism, but I do suspect that there is a little less optimism this year because of twin challenges. One, the Ukraine war, and of course, the pandemic, which isn't over, unfortunately. So when you came out with this report, based on Ukraine and COVID, what are your primary concerns?
So it's just to start to say that, of course, we live in a world that seems to be defined by challenges right now. 2022 has been a tough year, I think, for all of us. But it's important, and that's at the core of this meeting as well, it's important that it doesn't lead to the loss of agency. It's actually here that we want to make sure that we reinstitute a sense of agency, collective agency, to be able to do something about some of these crises that have transpired in 2022. Now, the Global Risk Report has been a knowledge tool, something that actually we've been publishing for many years. And again, it's not about just highlighting some of the risks that are on the horizons. Either, you may know, we scan the horizon for the next 2 years, but then also for 10 years. But it's really about how are we not naive about the landscape that is there, so we need to really map it. But then also, what does it mean for public-private cooperation, and what are the things we can do to anticipate some of these risks? So now we've published the latest edition. It's stemming from different sources, but of course it's relying a lot on experts as well as business executives. Gives you a sense of how people are looking at the horizon, 2 years and 10 years. Now the 2-year horizon, as you may know, the results are really heavily tilted toward looking at the cost of living crisis as well as geoeconomic pressures. Now, the 10-year horizon, the clear message is the climate challenge. And so I think this is important because it's also connected to the philosophy of the meeting. We're meeting here after 3 years of not being able to meet in January. So this is the first January meeting. And what is underpinning the meeting here is this dual vision, to be able to help leaders that are gathered here with solutions for the here and now, because arguably, if you're a leader right now, you're confronted with immense challenges around food, energy, inflation, etc. So navigating 2023 will be important. But then, how do you not lose sight of the both opportunities and challenges for the 10-year horizon? How do you invest in the future?
So let's talk a little bit about that 10-year horizon, but also something which we need to focus on now, sustainable growth. And by which I mean, it also includes a really close idea of where we are environmentally. The fact that the world hasn't been coming close to meeting its goals. But this remains a primary concern for you. So when you talk about sustainable growth, it's very much looking at the economy, the environment, and what it implies, right?
Absolutely. If I look at the program of the annual meeting, we have the largest number of sessions ever, dialogues, both public panels, but also working sessions on climate, nature, food, and energy. And we really treat it as one system, because you could argue that some of these deficiencies that we've had and some of the crises that we've experienced are actually the result of humankind and leaders not being able to connect issues better in a system. So particularly energy and nature and climate, very important that we tackle that together. Now, on the climate agenda, we have ongoing initiatives where we particularly focus on how business and government can work together. Now, we are, of course, working in parallel or in support of the official processes, so COP27, 28, very important. We're in between the two. And so we support with how do we make sure that, again, businesses and governments are looking at some concrete opportunities to make progress. So that's definitely one thing. The other thing, we are really on the front foot in terms of looking at how innovation can also help us get there. You may know that Fatih Birol, for example, from the International Energy Agency is quoted now, it's well known that up to a half of the technologies that we need to get to net zero are still not deployed at scale in the market. So what is it that we can do to help with that?
Sure.
And so here you will also see a lot of emphasis on solutions. So presenting these different innovations that may be at a nascent stage right now, but how do we help those solutions to scale? I think that will be important.
I think that's a big concern when it comes to green technologies and new technologies emerging, is the entire financing structure. Perhaps that's going to come up as well in conversations. I wanted to focus a little bit more on a couple of points in the report which have come out. Technology will exacerbate inequalities. Why do you say so?
It's really, of course, stemming from some of the survey data that we have there, and we're always looking at both. And so, as I mentioned, we feel that technology and innovation is so important for some of these challenges that we have in front of us, climate, trade as well, etc. And of course, we also need to be very realistic, or we need to say, okay, we are looking at the opportunities of technology and innovation, and how do we make sure that governments and businesses and civil society are also prepared for the potential risks, and again, how do we anticipate
What are those risks?
So
a digital divide, for example.
So we have
the cost of technology.
Of course, this is such an important issue. How do we make sure that technology is really a force for good? You may know that we have been working on creating a global network of centers for the fourth industrial revolution, and the motto of that is actually, how do we make sure that humankind and society has agency over the outcomes of deployment of these technologies? We also work a lot on how do we increase the access to technology. We have something called the Edison Alliance. So there is a lot of initiatives that we have around exactly that. How are we not just waiting for things to happen, but rather are proactive around decreasing the digital divide. But also, frankly, the big other big issue, as you know, is how do we make sure, for example, that out of the deployment of new technologies, we don't have bigger threats to democracies.
True.
And so, as you know, disinformation, misinformation, also digital safety for children.
Yes.
Those are big issues for parents, for people that care about democracy. And so it's really important that, again, we give the platform for leaders to think through those dilemmas. And how do we do our best to prevent those risks from happening?
Cybersecurity, that's a huge concern as well at so many levels, whether it's banking frauds or frauds perpetuated against individual nations. How do you look at cybersecurity as a real concern going forward?
As we become more digital, and we are digitizing our economies, also digital economies are a key source of new growth in the future. So if you connect it to the current rather challenging economic situation, it is so important that we use the opportunity of the digital economy to drive new growth. But as you said, as we are more integrated digitally, then of course we also have more at stake digital, and we have more to protect. And so there are, of course, leaders here that are from companies that have that are working on cybersecurity, but we also have leaders here that are we have heads of intelligence agencies here who are looking at different kinds of cyber threats. But we are also, of course, having other decision makers that are then helping, for example, companies think through what is it that they need to protect. Now, the key question is, what is critical infrastructure, for example? Because you could argue that over the past few years, you've seen a widening of the concept of what actually is critical in terms of infrastructure and what you need to protect, but you can't protect everything. So I think the core word here would be smart strategies to how to protect our increasingly digital lives and digital assets, again, to be able to also, frankly, drive recovery in the future.
Sure. One of the scariest things, perhaps the scariest one in the report, is the specter of a nuclear attack or a nuclear threat. I've covered the Ukraine war twice in the last couple of months, and that is a constant concern. All of Europe faces that threat. So everything we're talking about over here sort of comes under that overshadowing threat. Is that something that leaders here will be talking about? How does that affect your thinking as you came out with this report?
I think overall, let's face it, Russia's invasion of Ukraine brought back to a larger mainstream as a significant factor for decisions, geopolitics.
Yes.
You could argue that prior to that, it had been less of a factor globally for a lot of actors that were globally active. So it's back. We have a session here that is called Thinking the Unthinkable, about exactly that. And I don't think you would have found it here previously. Now, we take it extremely seriously because Russia is a nuclear power. They are part of the Security Council, and we have a hot war in a major country. And so it is really important that we not only dust off things that have been there in terms of the architecture for managing that risk, but are actually actively thinking, okay, with the new capabilities and the changed geopolitical landscape, are there things that we need to think anew around how to prevent this risk from ever, frankly, happening or manifesting itself in real life? So it is back on the agenda.
Yeah. A final question. India has a huge presence at the World Economic Forum. We've got a huge presence in Davos as well. While obviously building an interconnected world is your priority at the WEF, India is now at a time when our rate of growth is higher than most countries in the world. There's a genuine sense of optimism. Could you tell us a little bit about India and what you see at the WEF this year?
I think the big story is really the G20 presidency that is upcoming, and in a way, the role of India in the world, not only through the G20 presidency, but it's a nice also moment or important moment, is really how do you stem the tide of fragmentation in the world. So this is at the core of this meeting. We say cooperation in a fragmented world. And if I'm not mistaken, the motto of the G20 presidency is very similar, around one world. And so really the ability to come together, maybe not being completely naive. Of course, there are different perspectives on different things, but how do we better join up on issues like climate and trade? Because if we don't do that, we will have less growth, we will have more inflation, we will have more poverty in the world. And so the role of India could not be more important. Now you have outstanding participation here from the business sector, very strong participation from the governmental sector, a lot of also other innovators. And maybe just to finish on India, I think that it is one of the most exciting economies right now out there. As you said, relatively compared to others, high growth. Now, the big opportunity, of course, also is around the clean energy infrastructure. Yes. This is also, by the way, going to be a big topic here in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, the existing Green Deal in Europe. What are the clean energy infrastructure plans in the world as also a conduit for growth that is more inclusive will be key here, and I think India is a hot market for that.
Yeah. Well, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you so much. So there you have it, a snapshot of what the World Economic Forum 2023 is looking at. There is the spectre, a larger vision of a threat, the nuclear threat, but then there's cybersecurity as well. There's climate, which is the underlying challenge across the world. And ultimately, it's all about sustainable growth, sustainable development, sustainable economies, which ensure that millions around the world who are suffering are out of poverty. The world needs to come together. It cannot be fragmented. That perhaps is the central message.